What did that witch do at your wedding? I had two witches, my two great aunts. A week before my wedding, my great grandmother got really sick and was in the hospital. She pretty much knew it was her time. She was 94. We had several talks before that, and she was pretty clear that if she passed, she wanted me to continue with the wedding. She was the only person who knew I was pregnant, and she liked the idea of life leaving and a new life coming. I was heartbroken, but I had good closure because I was able to say goodbye to her. Me, my grandma, and my mom were the caretakers of my great grandmother. The two great aunts of mine were really involved and they lived on the other side of the country. So grandma is super sick and the end was coming, so the two great aunts come to town. And of course, instead of getting a hotel room or something, they just decide to live in great grandma's house till she passes. Before my great grandma has even passed away, great aunts are going around her house with sticky notes, putting their names on things. It was the most rude, greedy, self-centered thing I had ever experienced. Well, my husband and I got married and the aunts came uninvited to the wedding, eat a ton of food, and then just sit around talking loudly about how rude and selfish I am for having my wedding while my grandmother is in hospice. Let me also mention that I had a very small wedding with close friends and family and a potluck type meal. It wasn't like I was out partying and getting buzzed and stuff. I was just doing my thing. They didn't even need to come considering we barely knew each other. Even though me and my husband had our wedding, we canceled our honeymoon because I didn't want to leave town with my great-grandma being so sick. She passed the night of my wedding, so the next day these jerky aunts rent a U-Haul, load up everything in the house, and leave town. They left the house filthy, so me and my grandma and mom just cried while we cleaned up the mess they left behind in the mostly empty house. I refused to speak to them or have anything to do with them. I should also add that my great-grandma's religion required her to not have life support. The aunts hid her will with her DNR on it and refused to turn it over to the hospital for days, leaving my grandmother on life support against her will. As much as it sucked, it's also kind of beautiful that your great-grandma was the only one that knew that you were pregnant. That moment of talking about the wedding and telling her must have been so special. Story 2. That witch was one of the groomsmen in my best friend's wedding. He got his comeuppance though. My friend hated the guy, but he was the groom's cousin, so she was kind about it. Let's call him Eddie. He disrupted the ceremony numerous times on purpose. He started out making faces and noises, not subtly, more like a child making overtly funny faces. It was like he was trying to work the crowd. There was some kind of ritual involving holy water, and he made this dramatic, funny show of being splashed a bit. He was so over the top, it was like Uncle Joey from Full House in the middle of a very serious ceremony. He finally cracked a couple of jokes out loud toward the end. Nobody seemed amused at all, and a few of us looked ready to cut a witch. It was obnoxious and really embarrassing to witness, though the ceremony was otherwise lovely. Afterwards, we all headed to the beach to take photos before the reception. The bride was extremely stressed and trying to not let it get to her. Eddie was being a little witch and whining about everything, including how bored he was. He was in his 20s at the time. Eddie was still standing around complaining when a seagull flew over and took a massive dump directly on his head and the shoulder of his rented tux. Everyone is pointing and laughing, including the photographer. The photographer got a wonderful photo of the bride and me in our big dresses, arms around each other, having fallen to our knees in the sand, pointing and laughing at Poophead. Eddie flipped out and started whine yelling, "Stop laughing at me, this isn't frickin' funny, stop laughing," and stormed off. Drove back to the cabin, ditched the other groomsman, he was his ride, didn't show back up until a few hours into the reception, still steaming. We call this God's wedding gift to my best friend. Side note, the bride was already stressed that day for a lot of reasons. The groom's entire family was absolutely awful. They all shared a big cabin and they wouldn't even let my friend into one of the bathrooms to shower or get ready, so she was rushed and late. They wore jeans to the formal ceremony and reception because we don't dress up for anything. They showed up 2 hours late to the reception and brought their own cases of Coors to the fully stocked bar. My friend had no family on her side because her family is extremely cruel. Her dear friend who was supposed to officiate passed away very shortly before the wedding. Between all this and the groom's crazy family, she had a stressful day, but she kept a freaking great attitude despite it and was nothing but sweet. That seagull truly helped brighten her day and we'll all be eternally grateful to that bird. We still refer to him between each other as Poophead. He hasn't grown up one bit and behaves the same, but fortunately, she doesn't have to interact with him often. And yes, I truly felt bad for her too. She's really put up with a lot of crap in her life. It's kind of amazing. Her family is terribly cruel. She did have one incredibly sweet, supportive, distant relative who came, though, and lots of friends. His family is pretty crappy in a variety of ways that never ceases to amaze me. The wedding situation was stressful, but fortunately, the supportive people there came through, and so did that bird. I know thanks to the supportive people, especially her bridesmaid who flew from Europe to be there for her, she still had a good day despite the crap. Fortunately, she's weeded out all the bad people out of her life, and I admire the hell out of her. My mother is very cruel, but sometimes I can't comprehend the level of crap she's been through. This is a girl who goes on Craigslist regularly to find families in need so she can buy them things with money she barely has. I admire the hell out of her. I'm glad she still managed to have a mostly beautiful day because she deserves it. I have to add one more gushing story about her from her wedding. She wore a stunning red ball gown and was just beautiful. A little girl approached her on the street and asked if she was a princess. She knelt down like a damn Disney character and told the girl how pretty and special she was, and gave the girl some red roses from her bouquet. I seriously do not deserve this friend. Story 3. My step-aunt lives through her daughter. She lets that girl do anything she wants. She's 15 or 16. Well, literally, my husband and I walked in, did our dance, got our food, and sat down. My aunt comes over to our table and starts talking to us about how her daughter had a photo shoot and is basically a model, and how her daughter just broke up with her boyfriend that was sleeping in her bed because he was controlling. I took it with a grain of salt, no big deal. All the while, the daughter and her friend were dancing provocatively in white, tiny dresses. Honestly, the attire didn't bother me. I had people walking up to me telling me that those girls needed to cover up. Again, no big deal, teens will be teens. Here's the kicker. The daughter took a liking to one of my coworkers who was 5 years older than her. Remember, she was 15 or 16. So her mom is trying to hook them up. She told my friend that the daughter was 18 and spent the remainder of the night asking me to get his number and play messenger for her daughter. A few weeks down the line, I found out that the aunt and her daughter were talking crap about my brother, and I went off on them. Their response to me was that I'm nothing to them and I should have been grateful that they even came to my wedding and pretended that they liked me. Story 4. My sister's wedding, not mine. Bridesmaid is an hour late, shows up, and asks to borrow anyone's car for some unknown reason. Same bridesmaid is engaged to one guy, but a different guy shows up as her date to the wedding, then she proceeds to publicly just climb all over the guy. Everyone is leaving the reception. I'm helping my sister gather her things when we realize the guestbook is nowhere to be found. We're pretty sure that the same bridesmaid took it. She left before the cleanup because F everyone else. We tried to call her several times to no avail. Finally get a hold of her. She's at some hotel with a random date guy. She did, quote-unquote, accidentally take the guestbook. Pretty sure it was some idiotic plan to get my sister to go hang out with her instead of her now husband. Knowing this, my husband and I drive to the next town where the hotel is to get it from her instead to foil this stupid plan. Side note, she was pissed off from the beginning that I was the maid of honor at my own sister's wedding and not her. She repeatedly tried to take over the easier of the MOH roles. Of course, not the helping with prep part because that's just too much work. Story 5. My wife and I are about to do the first dance. My wife's grandfather walks up and says he wants to dance and then make a speech. Now these events are sort of timed with the DJ and food, etc. My wife explains that we are doing the first dance, then the parent dances, and she said she would be more than happy to dance with him after that, due to timing things out. The mother-son dance was very important to me because my mother had late-stage liver cancer and she was beyond excited to live to see her oldest son get married. She passed 7 months later. So we do the first dance, and right as I'm bringing my mom up, he makes a scene, leaves with his wife, and we don't see him the rest of the trip. Thank God the DJ was awesome because he just changed up the song because the one I was going to dance with my mom to was just about to come on. I talked to my wife, then I got to have my dance. Doesn't sound too terrible, but it was like the one part where things were timed out and had to go smoothly, and he upset my wife. I'm glad that you got that dance with your mom and your wife. Props to your wife, too, for not giving in to her witch of a grandpa for both your sakes. And props to you for making it halfway through the video, and while you're at it, why not hit that like button and subscribe to my channel? It really helps me out. Thank you. Let's go ahead and get back to the stories. Story 6. My wife's cousin got engaged at our wedding. She barely even made the cut to get on the guest list at our super small wedding. Her hairdresser boyfriend thought that right after toasts was the right moment to pop the question. They were sitting with my wife's parents, who had been super crappy and unsupportive even though we flew to the other side of the country to have the wedding in a place that was convenient to them. Naturally, this couple was sitting at my wife's family's table. Her family did nothing but fawn over this messed up cousin all night and then talk about that and only that for the next several months. Wife's mom threw a bridal shower for the cousin, not my wife, showered them with gifts, nothing for us. And what's crazy is that my wife and I are totally on okay terms with her family. Oh, and the cousin borrowed my photographer to take an impromptu engagement shoot on my dime out back, which resulted in my photographer missing the first dance. They're booking their wedding at the same venue, which was a destination location for us, with the same food vendor. It's a goddamn stone hearth pizza truck on wheels, and even asked for a copy of our vows. Story 7. Either the groom's dad, who got raging hammered and interrupted our wedding toast with a 14-minute-long ramble about his business and how he built my husband up and how he wouldn't have been a man without him, blah, 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 and he gave us $25 as a wedding gift. Or my husband's coworker, who not only brought his disaster of a wife, but his adult, mouth-breathing, public pickle tickler of a son. She wore her wedding dress to a barbecue. My reception was a barbecue. And they sat at our cake table. You know, the little table that the cake sits on by itself? They put their plates on it and sat there. Every freaking picture of my wedding cake has this guy and his brick, stupid, ugly family ducking into the shot, waving. I am still not over it. The wedding was over 17 years ago and the photos aren't digitized and it's become a canon family story. We were very young and none of us were confrontational. It was casual, so there weren't ushers in the classic sense. My maid of honor was buzzed. The best man thought it was hilarious. I can laugh about it now. Dave and his family are legendary. My husband worked with him for over 20 years and I have so many good stories. And yes, at the time of my wedding, his son was 34 years old, lived on his parents' couch, and watched lots of pro wrestling and pay-per-view. Functionally illiterate and had been recently arrested for having fun by himself in a convenience store. A public pickle tickler? At the wedding? In front of the cake? Oh man. Story 8. The minor thing was that she took the credit for everything that we did and heavily implied to her friends and family that she financed the whole shebang. She didn't. We paid for it all ourselves in cash, thank you very much. And my wife is an incredibly crafty woman who designed all of the decorations and designs herself, not that horrible excuse for a human being. There is no beauty in her life or her soul. The other, far more insidious thing she did was try and spread seeds of distrust in my new wife's heart by claiming she heard my family conspiring against her. That my father and brothers had been having an open conversation at our wedding while eating my food about how this marriage would never last and they were going to make sure of it. She also tried to convince my wife to leave me because she could tell I was cruel just by looking at him. Which didn't happen, but it took 3 years and a complete unmasking of this harpy before it all got out in the open. The woman was my wife's cousin, but thanks to the intricacies that govern the way small-town families interact, they grew up more like sisters. She and my wife were close for many years, and her cousin never hesitated to take advantage of this whenever the opportunity presented itself. Whether it was lying, cheating, or stealing, she always painted herself as the hero, and my wife, naive to a fault, always believed her. The rest of her family saw right through the charade, but this family is not one to talk out of turn. They will quietly discuss your life to each other, they will silently judge you, but they will never reveal negative feelings to the one they feel them for. And because my wife and her were close, they kept it all from her as well. Now my family, including myself, never trusted her, and she knew it. She made an effort to inspire fights without exposing herself as a source. She was constantly going to people and telling them what somebody else had said, even if no such discussion had taken place. My family was wise to these techniques immediately. You see, we talk to each other. If I think my brother is doing something stupid, I will tell him he is being 50 shades of and explain why I feel that way. I expect the same courtesy in return. If they felt I was marrying the wrong woman, they would have been hounding me to the ends of the earth about it. So when she started pulling this trick, a trick that worked amazingly well on her own family, we didn't fall for it. We just closed ranks, and she didn't like that. Like Grand Vizier Jafar, she began whispering into my wife's, then fiance's ear, how she was her only real friend, how I was just trying to keep them apart, how my mother didn't really like her, how my sister didn't respect her, how it was only a matter of time until I started separating her from the family, and her words, like critters, nourished themselves on the BS she spewed. My wife would come home from work. She insisted they had to be in communication from when she got in the car to when she parked to keep her safe from falling asleep, and look at me differently. She twisted my wife's perspective to believe that everyone else was lying and she was the only one telling the truth, the only one she could trust. The wedding wasn't where it ended, just a continuation of the same. It wasn't until the second year of our marriage that she began to fall apart. She herself began to implode. She had finally told too many lies to too many people. And the last straw, the very one that broke the camel's back, the person she told them to was me. I knew I couldn't trust her, but I also couldn't get rid of her. She was too firmly entrenched in my wife's brain. As much as I didn't want her in our lives, I also couldn't get rid of her, and I had embraced a sort of shaky truce between us. I never the master manipulator she worked me until I started coming around. I started to think that maybe she really was the victim here, and when she approached me with a business opportunity, I was hesitant but let her do her spiel, which I initially turned down. But she kept after me, and my wife kept after me, making bigger and bigger promises that there was no way she could possibly have kept, but she spun a good story. And God help me, I believed it. Somehow, despite everything I knew about this woman, she managed to get into my brain too. Even when things started to go bad in the first few weeks, I still believed. And when my checks started coming in late, I held on to that belief. Hell, by the end, I was covering material costs on my own credit cards. Because she was good. She'd been emotionally and mentally cruel to people her whole life. She knew just how to tear you down enough to destroy your self-worth and build you up just enough to make you crave the approval. She knew how to make you uncertain of your own memories, how to make you think that maybe she really was right all along. She had decades of experience at being the perpetrator to her husbands and her children and her friends. I was out of my depth and out of my league. And worst of all, she still had my wife under her thumb. So when I would come home from that, she would have already whispered into my wife's ear all the reasons why the things I might complain about were my fault. I could go on at length about the process, but in the end, she just tried to push too hard. Her substance use started to get out of control, her home life started to fall apart, and in the stress she was under, she pushed me far enough to push back. She thought she had me completely under control, but I am very much a stick in the mud, a mule. I can only be pushed in increments, and one night she overdid it. In the middle of the night, she showed up at my house, the mask off. She blamed every problem she'd ever had in her life on my wife. She blamed every problem she'd ever had in business on me. Every act she had ever performed as a human being had been to benefit us, despite how ungrateful we were. My wife was a bad person, a bad mother, a failure as a human being. I was a shoddy provider, a poor excuse for a craftsman. Even her exit from my home was extreme, cracking the drywall a la Cruella de Vil. For my wife, it was like waking up from a decades-long dream. It took weeks and further legal interaction before she really accepted that this was her real face. It took months before she could fully accept that I had been telling the truth. It took almost this entire year before she realized that maybe my family really hadn't been conspiring against her this whole time. She had to be essentially deprogrammed. And to this day, she'll have moments when she will suddenly stop what she's doing, turn to me, and tell me something like, I can't believe that she had me convinced that I had to buy her kids groceries because she had no money, but could still afford smoke, grass, and booze, which is something she actually did do. The story goes on. The whole ordeal had left us financially broken. We did recover, but I had to turn to 3 different government bodies to get what I was owed going back to when she stopped paying me. The sheer volume of laws she broke, whether through design or ignorance, confounded even the most jaded representative we spoke with. And somehow, through all of it, she still maintained that we were the ones at fault. that we were the villains of the whole ordeal, that my wife, now that she was no longer under her control, had been the master manipulator her whole life, ruining things for her at every turn. To this day, that is the story she tells, and as I understand, she still has quote-unquote friends who believe it. But no more family. My wife was the last link she had to her blood, and that bridge has been destroyed as thoroughly as the Library of Alexandria. I could go on and on and on, and I could go back and tell stories from anywhere at the beginning, middle, and end. I have, and I'm sure I will again, but that's the broad strokes. So that last one was a doozy, eh? I hope you enjoyed the whole video and all the crazy duty people in it. And if you made it this far, I'm sure you're also going to enjoy the next one. What's your weddings ruined by a guest story? Story 3 was a nightmare. I'll see you in that video, and thank you for watching this one.